The scream came from the east wing before the sun had fully risen, and every servant in Glenmara Manor froze where they stood. A tray of teacups shattered against the stone floor upstairs. A woman's voice cried out in fright, footsteps pounded down the grand staircase, and within moments, a nurse in a gray uniform burst through the front doors clutching her bag to her chest, tears streaming down her face, refusing to look back at the house she was fleeing. Mrs. Winifred Pratt, the housekeeper, stood at the bottom of the stairs with her hands folded tightly in front of her apron, watching the nurse disappear down the long gravel drive, without a single word of farewell. It was the 4th nurse that season, the 11th in a year and a half. Mrs. Pratt did not chase after her, did not call out an apology, because she already knew what had happened upstairs, and she already knew there was nothing anyone could say to make the woman stay. Upstairs, in the darkest and grandest bedroom of Glenmara Manor, Duke Alaric Glenmara lay against a mountain of pillows, his chest rising and falling with the effort of breathing, his face pale as candle wax, his eyes burning with a fury that had nothing to do with the illness eating away at him. A shattered glass lay near the door where he had thrown it. His hands trembled, not from weakness alone, but from the force of his own anger. "Get out," he had said to the nurse, only minutes before, his voice low and cutting, despite how frail his body had become. "Get out of my house, and do not send another one in your place." The nurse had tried to reason with him, had tried to explain that the medicine needed to be taken on schedule, that his fever would worsen if he refused the treatment again. But the Duke had no patience left for gentle voices and careful explanations. He had spent 18 months listening to doctors, nurses, and specialists tell him what his body needed, and 18 months watching every single one of them eventually give up on him, just as everyone else in his life already had. Glenmara Manor stood on a hill overlooking green fields and a slow, winding river, a house that had once been filled with laughter and music, with grand dinners and dancing in the ballroom, with the sound of the Duke's father's booming voice welcoming guests from every corner of the county. Now the halls were quiet, except for the occasional creak of old wood and the hushed whispers of servants who tiptoed past the master's door, as though the illness itself might reach out and catch them too. It had begun 2 years earlier, a fever that would not break, a weakness in his limbs that no doctor could properly name, a wasting of his body that left him thinner and grayer each month. The physicians spoke in confused terms about his condition, some calling it a disease of the blood, others insisting it was a sickness of the nerves, and none of them offering him a clear path to recovery. What they agreed on was that his chances improved only if he cooperated, if he ate what was given to him, rested when told to rest, and allowed his caregivers to do their work without resistance. But Alaric Glenmara had stopped believing in improvement long ago. His father had died suddenly the same winter his illness began, collapsing in the study from a weak heart, leaving Alaric the title of Duke and the weight of an estate he had never expected to inherit so young. And within months of his father's funeral, the woman he had planned to marry, Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, had written him a short letter explaining that she could not commit her future to a man whose health had become so uncertain. She left the county entirely, moving to live with relatives near the coast, and never wrote to him again. Grief and betrayal arrived together that year, and Alaric had built a wall so thick around himself that no nurse, however kind or however skilled, had managed to get past it since. He did not want comfort. He did not want careful words or patient smiles. He wanted to be left alone, to suffer in whatever way suited him, and anyone who tried to interfere with that plan was met with the same cold cruelty that had just sent another nurse running down the gravel drive in tears. Mrs. Pratt climbed the stairs slowly that morning, her knees aching with the effort, and knocked once on the heavy oak door, before entering, without waiting for permission. She had worked at Glenmara Manor for over 20 years, had known the Duke since he was a boy, running through the gardens with his father, and she was one of the very few people left in the house who was not afraid to face him directly. "That is the 4th one this season, Your Grace," she said, standing near the doorway with her arms crossed. "The agency in town has already sent word that they will not be recommending any more nurses to this house." Alaric turned his head slowly against the pillow, his eyes meeting hers with an exhaustion that went far deeper than his physical illness. "Then do not hire another one," he said. "I did not ask for her to be here in the first place." "Dr. Hale insists you cannot be left without care," Mrs. Pratt replied. her voice firm, despite the weariness in it. "Your fever spikes in the night. Someone must be here to bring down your temperature, to make certain you take your medicine, to watch that you do not choke in your sleep." "Let me choke then," Alaric muttered, closing his eyes. Mrs. Pratt did not flinch at the words, though her heart ached to hear them. She had heard him say worse in recent months, had grown used to the bitterness that had replaced the warm, curious young man she remembered from years before. She crossed the room and opened the heavy curtains, letting a thin stream of morning light fall across the floor, ignoring his low groan of protest. "You may hate every person who tries to help you," she said quietly, "but I will not let you die in a dark room out of spite, not while I have breath in my body to prevent it." He said nothing in response, only turned his face away from the light, and Mrs. Pratt left the room with the same tired determination she carried every single day, wondering how much longer the household could continue this way, wondering if there was any nurse left in the entire county willing to walk through that door again. 3 days later, a young woman named Mara Doyle arrived at the servants' entrance of Glenmara Manor, carrying a small cloth bag with everything she owned inside it. She had traveled 2 days by cart and on foot from a small village near the northern hills, answering an advertisement posted in the local paper for a scullery maid, a position far below the grand halls and private chambers of the manor's upper floors. She had no interest in nursing, no training in medicine, and no idea of the reputation the house had earned throughout the county. Mara was 23 years old, with dark hair pulled back in a simple braid, and eyes that held a quiet steadiness rarely seen in someone so young. She moved through the world carefully, speaking only when necessary, observing everything around her, with a calm attention that made people either trust her instantly or find her strangely unreadable. Those who knew her well understood that her quietness was not emptiness, but the result of having already survived something that had hollowed out the noise inside her. 2 years before arriving at Glenmara, Mara had nursed her younger brother, Liam, through a long illness that no doctor in their village could properly treat. She had sat beside his bed night after night, changing linens, cooling his fever, holding his hand through pain that no medicine could fully ease, and in the end, she had watched him take his final breath in the early hours of a spring morning, while the rest of the house slept. The experience had left a permanent mark on her, not one of despair, but one of a strange, settled peace about suffering and mortality that most people her age had never had reason to develop. She arrived at the servants' door of Glenmara Manor just after midday, her boots dusty from the road, and was greeted by a younger maid named Effie, who led her through the kitchen corridors, toward the housekeeper's small office near the back of the house. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and simmering broth, and the warmth of the ovens was a welcome change after 2 days of traveling in the cold. "You will want to keep to the lower floors," Effie whispered as they walked, glancing over her shoulder, as though the walls themselves might be listening. "Especially the east wing. That is where His Grace stays, and no one goes near there unless they absolutely must." "Why is that?" Mara asked, though something in her already suspected the answer before it came. "The Duke is very ill," Effie said, lowering her voice further. "He has driven off every nurse the agency has sent, 11 of them, maybe more. Some say he throws things. Some say he shouts terrible words at anyone who tries to help him. Mrs. Pratt says he wishes to be left to die, and none of us dare argue with him about it." Mara said nothing to this, only nodded once, filing the information away quietly, as she had learned to do with most things in her life. She did not judge the Duke for his anger, having seen firsthand how illness could twist a person's spirit into something unrecognizable even to themselves. She had watched her own brother, gentle and easy-tempered his whole life, snap at her in his final weeks, with words that had nothing to do with who he truly was. Mrs. Pratt looked up from her desk when the 2 young women entered her small office, studying Mara with the practiced eye of someone who had hired and dismissed dozens of servants over the years. She saw a young woman who stood straight, despite obvious exhaustion, whose hands were steady, whose gaze did not waver under scrutiny. "You are here for the scullery position," Mrs. Pratt said, not quite a question. "Yes, ma'am," Mara answered. "I saw the advertisement in the northern paper. You understand the work is hard, long hours, difficult tasks, very little rest in the early weeks, until you find your rhythm." "I understand," Mara said simply. "I am not afraid of hard work." Mrs. Pratt studied her for another long moment, something in the young woman's calm demeanor catching her attention in a way she could not quite explain. There was a stillness to Mara that reminded her, faintly and strangely, of the quiet strength required to sit beside someone suffering without flinching away from it. But she set the thought aside, as nothing more than an old woman's fanciful imagination, and gestured for Mara to follow her toward the servants' quarters. "You will begin in the kitchens tomorrow morning," Mrs. Pratt said as they walked. "Under no circumstances are you to go near the east wing of this house. That is where His Grace resides, and his private chambers are not to be disturbed by anyone outside his approved care staff. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Mara said again, though even as the words left her mouth, she felt a small, curious pull toward the forbidden wing, the same instinct that had once drawn her toward her brother's sick room when everyone else in the house had wanted to look away. That night, Mara lay on a narrow cot in the shared servants' quarters, listening to the unfamiliar creaks and settling sounds of the old manor around her. Somewhere far above, in a part of the house she had been warned never to approach, she thought she heard the faint, muffled sound of someone coughing, a deep, rattling cough that seemed to carry through the very walls of the building. She lay still in the darkness, staring up at the low ceiling, and found herself thinking not of the Duke's cruelty that the other servants had described, but of the simple fact that somewhere above her, a man was suffering alone in the dark, refusing every hand that reached toward him. She thought of Liam, of the nights she had sat beside him, when he had shouted at her to leave him be, when his pain had twisted his gentle nature into something sharp and unfamiliar, and she remembered the moment she had finally understood that his anger was never truly meant for her. It was meant for the illness itself, for the unfairness of a body failing before its time, for the terror of facing an ending no one could properly prepare for. She had learned, through him, that some people needed to push everyone away before they could allow themselves to be helped at all. Mara closed her eyes that first night at Glenmara Manor, with those thoughts still turning quietly in her mind, unaware that fate, or perhaps simple chance, was already arranging the path that would lead her toward the Duke's door, far sooner than anyone in the house could have predicted. The manor slept uneasily around her, its master alone in his dark chamber at the end of the east wing. And somewhere in the space between the kitchens and the grand staircase, a quiet change was already beginning to take shape, one that neither the Duke nor the new scullery maid yet understood was coming. Morning arrived with a pale gray light over the hills surrounding Glenmara, and the household stirred into its usual rhythm of chores and duties. Mara rose before dawn, as she had been instructed, and made her way to the kitchens where the head cook, a broad-shouldered woman named Constance, set her immediately to peeling vegetables and scrubbing pots that had been left from the previous night's meal. The work was hard and repetitive, exactly as Mrs. Pratt had promised, but Mara found a certain comfort in the simplicity of it, in the way her hands stayed busy while her mind remained quiet. The morning passed without incident, the kitchen filling with the usual chatter of servants discussing the day's tasks, occasional laughter breaking through the clatter of dishes and the hiss of boiling water. Mara listened more than she spoke, learning names and faces, understanding the unspoken rules of the household through careful observation, rather than direct instruction. She noticed how the servants lowered their voices whenever a task required them to approach the east wing, how even the mention of fetching linens for the Duke's chambers caused a visible tension among the younger staff. By midday, word came down from the upper floors that the Duke had refused his morning medicine again, throwing the cup across the room before the nurse currently assigned to him could even explain its purpose. The nurse, a stern older woman who had lasted longer than most, appeared in the kitchen doorway, looking pale and shaken, requesting fresh linens to replace those soiled during the disturbance. Constance sent one of the younger kitchen maids to fetch them from the storage room down the hall, but the girl returned moments later, insisting she could not carry the heavy stack alone. It was in that small, unremarkable moment, born from nothing more than an overworked kitchen and a minor logistical difficulty, that Mrs. Pratt, passing through the kitchen corridor on her way to handle another household matter, glanced around for available hands and found Mara standing nearby, her own tasks momentarily paused. "You," Mrs. Pratt said, gesturing toward her without much thought behind the choice, "take these linens up to the east wing. Leave them at the door and do not go inside. Someone from His Grace's care staff will be waiting to receive them. Mara nodded, gathering the heavy stack of fresh linens into her arms, and made her way up the back staircase, toward the wing of the house she had been so firmly warned to avoid on her very first day. Her heart did not race with fear as she climbed, though perhaps it should have, given everything she had already heard about the man who waited somewhere beyond those unfamiliar corridors. Instead, she felt only a quiet curiosity, the same steady calm that had carried her through every difficult moment of her life so far, guiding her feet forward one step at a time toward a door she did not yet know would change the entire course of her future. The east wing was colder than the rest of the house, the corridors dimmer, the heavy curtains drawn tightly against what little daylight tried to reach the windows. Mara walked slowly, counting doors as she had been instructed, until she reached the end of the hallway, where a single closed door marked the private chambers of the Duke of Glenmara. She lifted her hand to knock, expecting someone to answer and take the linens from her, as Mrs. Pratt had promised, but no one came. From somewhere just beyond the door, she heard a low, ragged breathing, followed by the sound of something shifting weakly against fabric, as though a person too exhausted to rise was still trying to move. She waited another moment, listening carefully, and when no footsteps approached from within to receive her delivery, Mara made a decision that would set everything that followed into motion. She pushed the door open just enough to step inside, carrying the linens with her, prepared to leave them quietly on the nearest table and depart without disturbing whoever lay within. What she found instead was a man far more fragile than the terrifying figure the servants downstairs had described, lying amid tangled, sweat-soaked sheets, his face turned toward the window with an expression of such deep and quiet suffering that it stopped Mara completely still in the doorway. This was not the raging, cruel master of the house the rumors had painted. This was simply a man in pain, utterly alone, with no one left in the room to witness whatever silent battle he was fighting against his own failing body. Mara stood frozen in the doorway for only a moment, before her instincts, sharpened by 2 years of caring for her dying brother, took over completely. She did not think about the warnings Mrs. Pratt had given her, did not think about the 11 nurses who had already fled this very room in tears, and did not think about the risk of angering a man known throughout the county for his temper. She saw only a person suffering, and something in her simply could not turn away from that. She set the stack of linens down gently on a nearby chest and moved toward the water basin resting on the small table beside the bed. The basin had been knocked sideways, water spilled across the wooden surface and dripping onto the floor in a slow, steady trickle. A shattered cup lay in pieces near the door, evidence of whatever confrontation had driven the previous nurse away that morning. Mara collected the broken pieces carefully into her apron, wiped the spilled water with a spare cloth, and only then allowed herself a proper look at the man in the bed. Duke Alaric Glenmara appeared even more diminished up close than the shadows near the window had suggested. His cheeks were hollow, his skin pale with a faint yellow undertone that spoke of a body no longer processing nourishment as it should. Dark circles ringed his eyes, though those eyes, when they finally turned toward her, still held a spark of sharp awareness that surprised her. He was clearly exhausted, clearly unwell, but not nearly as far gone as the rumors downstairs had implied. "Who are you?" he said, his voice hoarse and low, though the words carried an edge of suspicion rather than outright hostility. "You are not one of the nurses." "No, Your Grace," Mara answered simply, continuing to fold the soiled linens near the edge of the bed, without meeting his gaze directly. "I was asked to bring fresh linens. I did not mean to disturb you." "Then leave them and go," he said, turning his face back toward the window, dismissing her as easily as he had dismissed every other person who had entered this room in recent memory. Mara did not argue, did not offer sympathy, did not attempt the gentle, coaxing tone the previous nurses had likely used in hopes of softening his mood. She simply continued her work, changing the top sheet with careful, practiced movements, tucking the fresh linen into place around him with a gentleness that required no words to accompany it. When she finished, she gathered the soiled bedding into her arms and turned to leave, exactly as he had instructed. It was the silence that unsettled him most. Every nurse before her had spoken constantly, offering explanations, asking questions about his comfort, trying to engage him in conversation, meant to distract from his pain. Mara said nothing beyond her brief answer, asked for nothing, expected nothing, and left the room as quietly as she had entered it, Alaric lay still for a long moment after the door clicked shut behind her, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand why the absence of her voice bothered him more than the presence of anyone else's ever had. Downstairs, Mara returned the soiled linens to the laundry room, without mentioning to anyone what had happened in the Duke's chamber. She had no wish to draw attention to herself, no interest in being seen as brave or foolish for entering a room she had been forbidden to approach. She resumed her duties in the kitchen, as though nothing unusual had occurred, though something in her mind kept returning to the image of the Duke's hollow, exhausted face, so different from the monster the other servants had described, with such fear in their voices. That evening, as the household staff gathered briefly in the servants' dining hall for their own simple supper, word arrived that the current nurse assigned to the Duke had given her notice, unwilling to continue in a position that required her to endure daily verbal abuse, with no improvement in her patient's condition to show for her effort. Mrs. Pratt received the news with a weary sigh, rubbing her temples as she calculated how many days might pass before the agency could send a replacement, if they agreed to send one at all. "We cannot leave him without someone in the room overnight," she said to Constance, the head cook, as the two women discussed the situation near the kitchen hearth. Dr. Hale was quite clear that his fever requires monitoring through the night. If it rises too high without anyone there to cool him, the consequences could be severe. "There is no one left to send," Constance replied. "Every maid in this house has already refused to go near him after hearing what happened to the others." Mrs. Pratt's gaze drifted, almost without conscious thought, toward the corner of the kitchen where Mara sat quietly finishing her supper, apart from the louder conversations of the younger staff around her. She remembered the strange stillness she had noticed in the young woman on her first day, the steady calm that seemed unusual for someone so young, and though she still could not fully explain the instinct, she found herself walking toward Mara's table before she had entirely decided to do so. "You went into His Grace's chamber this afternoon," Mrs. Pratt said, not a question, but a simple statement of fact, watching for Mara's reaction. Mara looked up, unsurprised that the housekeeper knew, though she had not mentioned it to anyone. "I did," she admitted. "He was not receiving the linens, and I did not wish to leave them outside the door where they might be forgotten." "And what did you find when you entered?" Mara considered the question carefully before answering, choosing her words with the same deliberate care she brought to everything else. "I found a man in a great deal of pain," she said. "Not the temper the others described, only pain, and perhaps exhaustion beyond what any of us can properly imagine." Mrs. Pratt studied her for a long moment, the noise of the kitchen fading into the background, as she weighed a decision she knew carried real risk. She had no way of knowing whether this quiet young scullery maid would fare any better than 11 trained nurses had, and she certainly had no authority to ask a kitchen worker to take on responsibilities so far outside the scope of her hired position. But desperation had a way of narrowing choices until only the unlikely ones remained. "I have no right to ask this of you," Mrs. Pratt said finally, lowering her voice so the surrounding conversations would not overhear. "You were hired for the kitchens, not for the sick room, and no one would think less of you for refusing. But His Grace requires someone to sit with him tonight, someone to watch his fever and see that he does not harm himself in his sleep. Every other member of this staff has already refused, out of fear or simple exhaustion with his temper. I am asking if you would be willing to try, just for tonight, until other arrangements can be made." Mara did not hesitate as long as the housekeeper might have expected. She thought briefly of her brother, of the nights she had sat beside him when everyone else in the house had grown too tired or too frightened to continue, and she thought of the hollow, suffering face she had seen that afternoon behind the Duke's anger. "I will sit with him tonight," she said simply. Mrs. Pratt exhaled a breath she had not realized she was holding, relief and uncertainty mingling together on her tired features. "You must understand," she cautioned, "that he may not welcome your presence. He may say things meant to drive you away, just as he has driven away everyone before you. You are not obligated to endure cruelty simply because I have asked this favor of you." "I understand," Mara said, and something in the steadiness of her voice convinced Mrs. Pratt, at least for the moment, that perhaps this unusual young woman truly did. Mara climbed the stairs to the east wing an hour later, carrying a small lamp and a fresh basin of cool water, prepared for whatever reception awaited her. She knocked softly on the heavy door before entering, a courtesy none of the exhausted nurses before her had likely bothered to maintain by this point in their tenure. and stepped inside to find the Duke exactly where she had left him that afternoon, propped against his pillows with his eyes fixed on the dark window. "You again," he said, his voice carrying a note of weary surprise rather than outright hostility. "I was told the nurse gave her notice." "She did, Your Grace," Mara said, setting the basin down on the small table and arranging the fresh cloths beside it with quiet efficiency. "I have been asked to sit with you tonight." "You are a kitchen maid," he said, something close to disbelief coloring his tone. "You have no training for this." "No," Mara agreed evenly. "I have no formal training, but I have sat with the sick before, and I do not frighten easily." Alaric studied her for a long moment in the dim lamplight, taking in her simple dress, her steady hands, the calm expression that revealed nothing of fear or discomfort, despite everything she must have heard about him from the rest of the household. He had expected, if anyone came at all, another version of the careful, professional strangers who had cycled through his room for the past year and a half, each one eventually breaking under the weight of his anger and his refusal to be helped. This young woman looked at him differently, without the practiced patience of someone paid to tolerate difficult patients, but with something closer to simple, unguarded steadiness. "You should leave," he said, though the words carried less force than they once might have. "I have no use for company, and I promise you, I am not pleasant to be near when the fever rises." "I did not come for pleasant company, Your Grace," Mara replied, moving to the chair positioned near his bed and settling into it without waiting for permission. "I came to make certain the fever does not take you unattended in the night." Something flickered across his face at those words, an expression Mara could not quite identify, though it looked almost like surprise, mingled with something softer and more vulnerable beneath it. He said nothing further for several long minutes, simply watching her as she arranged her supplies with quiet, unhurried movements, waiting for the storm of insults or complaints that had driven away every predecessor before her. But no storm came from Mara's direction, and slowly, cautiously, he found himself lowering the sharp edge of his guard, if only slightly, if only for the moment. The hours passed in relative quiet after that, Mara checking his temperature periodically with a cool cloth against his forehead, offering him water when his throat grew dry, adjusting his blankets when the fever caused him to shiver, despite the warmth of the room. She did not attempt conversation beyond what was necessary, did not ask him prying questions about his condition or his feelings, and did not offer the false, cheerful encouragement that had grated so badly against his nerves in the past. She simply performed her small tasks with patient, steady attention, and gradually, as the night deepened, Alaric found the tension in his shoulders easing in a way he had almost forgotten was possible. Near midnight, his fever spiked sharply, his body trembling beneath the blankets despite the warmth of the fire Mara had built up in the hearth. He gritted his teeth against the discomfort, refusing to voice any complaint, though sweat beaded across his forehead, and his breathing grew labored with the effort of enduring it. Mara noticed immediately, rising from her chair to press a fresh, cool cloth against his skin, her movements calm and unhurried, despite the obvious severity of what was happening. "This will pass," she said quietly, more to herself than to him, though he heard the words clearly in the silence of the room. "Fevers like this always break eventually, if the body is given the chance to fight them properly." "You speak as though you have seen this before," he managed between labored breaths. "I have," Mara said simply, not offering further explanation, though something in her tone suggested a depth of experience she was not yet ready to share with a man she had known for less than a single day. The fever broke sometime before dawn, leaving Alaric drenched in sweat, but breathing more easily, his body finally settling into an exhausted, genuine sleep, rather than the restless tossing that had marked most of his nights for months. Mara remained in her chair until the first gray light of morning crept through the curtains, watching over him with the same quiet attention she had maintained throughout the entire night. And when Mrs. Pratt arrived to check on the situation, she found the housekeeper's newest scullery maid still sitting patiently beside the sleeping Duke, exhausted herself, but undeniably, remarkably present. "He slept through the night," Mrs. Pratt whispered, astonishment clear in her voice as she took in the peaceful scene before her. "He has not slept a full night in months." Mara only nodded, too tired for many words after the long night, but something in her chest felt quietly, unexpectedly settled, as though she had found, without quite meaning to, a purpose that fit her far better than scrubbing pots in the kitchen ever had. She did not yet know what this single night would mean for her future at Glenmara Manor, did not yet understand how completely her presence would come to matter to the man sleeping soundly before her for the first time in longer than either of them could properly remember. But as she rose stiffly from her chair, to return to her ordinary duties, she carried with her the quiet certainty that she would return to this room again, whether anyone formally asked her to or not. Word of what had happened in the East Wing spread through the household by mid-morning, though Mara herself said nothing about it to anyone, beyond confirming the simple fact when asked directly. The younger kitchen maids whispered among themselves in disbelief that the new scullery girl had not only survived a full night alone with the Duke, but that he had actually slept, a thing none of them could recall happening in longer than they could remember. Constance the cook watched Mara with new interest as she returned to her ordinary duties that morning, though Mara herself gave no indication that anything remarkable had occurred, simply resuming her work at the wash basin, as though the previous night had been nothing more than an ordinary shift. Mrs. Pratt found herself facing a decision she had not anticipated needing to make so quickly. The agency in town had made clear they would not be sending further nurses to Glenmara Manor after the recent string of resignations, leaving the household with no formal medical staff to care for the Duke, beyond the periodic visits of Dr. Hale, who could not remain in residence permanently given his other patients throughout the county. And yet here was a young scullery maid, hired only days earlier for work far below the sick room, who had managed in a single night what 11 trained nurses had failed to accomplish over the course of 18 months. She summoned Mara to her small office that afternoon, studying the young woman across her desk with an expression that mixed genuine gratitude with lingering uncertainty about the path forward. "I must ask you something further," Mrs. Pratt began, choosing her words carefully. "What you did last night was more than anyone had a right to expect from you. But I find myself in a difficult position. There is no one else in this household willing or able to sit with His Grace through the nights ahead, and Dr. Hale insists the fever monitoring cannot be neglected." Mara waited quietly, sensing what was coming before the housekeeper finished speaking. "I would like to ask you to continue," Mrs. Pratt said finally. "Not permanently, not as a formal arrangement, but for the time being, until other options present themselves. Your wages would be adjusted accordingly, and your kitchen duties reduced to accommodate the change. But I want you to understand fully what you would be agreeing to. His Grace has not been kind to anyone who has tried to help him. There is no guarantee last night will repeat itself. He may return to his usual temper the moment his fever settles and his strength returns even slightly." Mara considered the offer for a long moment, though in truth, her decision had already formed somewhere in the quiet hours of the previous night, watching over a man too proud and too wounded to ask for the help he so clearly needed. She thought of her brother again, of the months she had spent at his bedside, enduring his sharp words and sudden angers, understanding even then that his cruelty had never truly been meant for her. "I will continue," she said simply. "For as long as I am needed." Mrs. Pratt nodded, relief evident in the slight easing of the tension around her eyes, though she offered one final word of caution before Mara departed the office. "Do not mistake his silence for gentleness," she said. "Do not expect gratitude. He has forgotten, I think, how to offer it." Mara returned to the East Wing that evening, with a small bag of fresh supplies, prepared to resume the same quiet routine that had carried her through the previous night. She found the Duke awake when she entered, propped up against his pillows, with a book resting unopened on his lap, his eyes following her movements with a wariness that had not entirely faded despite the peaceful night they had shared. "They have made you my permanent keeper, then," he said, his tone carrying an edge of bitter amusement rather than outright hostility. "For now, Your Grace," Mara replied, setting her supplies down near the water basin. "Unless you would prefer someone else." "There is no one else," he said flatly. "You have discovered that much already, I imagine." "I have," she admitted, moving to check the level of water in the pitcher beside his bed. "Though I did not come here to discuss who else might have taken this position. I came to see that you eat something this evening, since I understand you refused your supper again." His eyes narrowed slightly at the directness of her statement, unused to being addressed so plainly by anyone in his household staff. Most had approached him with careful, deferential caution, softening every request until it barely resembled a request at all, terrified of provoking the temper that had become so infamous throughout the county. Mara's tone held no such careful softness, only a calm, matter-of-fact honesty that left him uncertain how to respond. "I am not hungry," he said, though the words carried less conviction than his usual dismissals. "You are rarely hungry," Mara observed, retrieving a small tray of simple broth and bread that Constance had prepared earlier, setting it on the table beside his bed, without waiting for further protest. "But your body requires nourishment regardless of your appetite, if it is ever to properly heal. And if I refuse to eat it? Then I imagine it will grow cold, and you will remain as weak as you are now," Mara said simply, settling into her usual chair beside the bed, without any visible frustration at his resistance. "I cannot force a spoon into your mouth, Your Grace. That choice remains entirely yours." Something in her calm acceptance of his potential refusal seemed to catch him off guard, more than any argument or plea might have. He had expected, based on months of experience with previous caregivers, either stern insistence or wounded disappointment at his defiance. Mara offered neither, simply stating the plain reality of the situation and allowing him the dignity of his own choice, however self-destructive that choice might be. He stared at the tray for a long moment, the broth's warm steam rising gently in the lamplight, before finally, wordlessly, reaching for the spoon and taking the first slow sip. Mara said nothing to acknowledge the small victory, did not offer praise or visible relief, simply continued her quiet tasks around the room, as though his eating were the most ordinary thing in the world, rather than the first meal he had willingly finished in nearly a week. The following days settled into a careful, tentative rhythm between them. Mara arrived each evening with her supplies, checked his fever, encouraged him gently toward his meals and his medicine, and sat quietly through the long hours of the night, without demanding conversation or gratitude in return. Alaric, for his part, gradually stopped throwing the small tests he had once used to drive away his caregivers, though he remained sharp-tongued and distant, testing the boundaries of her patience in smaller, quieter ways that seemed almost designed to see how far he could push before she, too, finally broke and fled like all the others. One evening, nearly a week into their new arrangement, he refused his medicine outright, knocking the small cup from her hand before she could offer it to him, sending the bitter liquid splashing across the floor and the hem of her dress. Mara said nothing in the immediate aftermath, simply retrieved a cloth and cleaned the spill without any visible reaction, though he watched her closely, clearly expecting some response, some crack in her composure, that would finally confirm what he seemed to both fear and, on some deeper level, almost hope to prove true about himself. "You are not going to shout at me," he said finally, when she had finished cleaning, and returned to her chair without a single word of complaint. "No," Mara said simply. "Why not?" She considered the question seriously before answering, understanding somehow that this moment mattered more than it appeared on the surface. "Because I do not believe you spilled that medicine out of true anger toward me," she said. "I believe you spilled it because you are frightened, and because shouting and pushing people away has become easier than admitting that fear to anyone, including yourself." The room fell utterly silent following her words, the only sound the crackle of the fire in the hearth and the distant call of a night bird somewhere beyond the window. Alaric stared at her with an expression she could not fully read, something between disbelief and a raw, exposed vulnerability that he clearly had not intended to reveal. No one, in the 18 months since his illness had begun, had spoken to him so directly about the truth beneath his anger. The nurses had tolerated his outbursts or fled from them, but none had ever named what actually caused them, and certainly none had done so with such quiet, unflinching gentleness. "You know nothing about what frightens me," he said finally, though the words lacked their usual bite, sounding instead almost defensive, almost pleading for her to be wrong. "Perhaps not the particulars," Mara agreed, "but I recognize the shape of it well enough. I have sat with fear like yours before, in someone I loved very much." He wanted to ask her more, wanted to understand what she meant by those words, what history she carried that allowed her to see through his defenses so easily, when trained professionals had failed to manage it for a year and a half. But something in his pride, still raw and wounded despite the gentle honesty of the moment, held the question back, and instead he simply reached for the small cup of medicine. Mara offered him a second time, drinking it without further protest, his hand trembling only slightly as he did. Over the following 2 weeks, small changes began to accumulate in ways almost too subtle to notice individually, though the cumulative effect became impossible to ignore. Alaric slept more nights through without severe fever spikes. He finished his meals more consistently, sometimes even requesting a second helping without prompting. He asked Mara occasional questions about her life beyond the manor, about the village she had come from, though he never pressed when she offered only brief, careful answers in return. The household staff, watching from a cautious distance, began to whisper not about the Duke's cruelty, but about the strange, quiet transformation taking place in the East Wing, though none of them dared approach the situation too closely, for fear of disrupting whatever fragile progress had begun. Dr. Hale, arriving for his regular visit near the end of the second week, examined the Duke with visible surprise at the improvement in his condition, checking his pulse and his color, with the careful attention of a man who had genuinely expected to find continued decline, rather than progress. "Your fever has stabilized considerably," the doctor said, packing away his instruments with a thoughtful expression. "And you have gained a little weight, I think, since my last visit. Whatever has changed in your care these past weeks, I would encourage you to continue it." Alaric said nothing in response to this observation, though his eyes drifted briefly toward the doorway, where Mara stood, with a fresh basin of water, her expression as calm and unreadable as always, despite the doctor's clear implication of her role in his improvement. She met his gaze for only a moment before looking away, returning to her quiet tasks without acknowledgement of the credit being offered, and something about her deliberate humility struck him more deeply than any open pride could have. That night, after the doctor had departed and the house had settled into its usual evening quiet, Alaric found himself watching Mara as she moved about the room with her familiar, unhurried efficiency, and a question rose in him that he had been holding back for days, uncertain whether he had any right to ask it of a woman who owed him nothing beyond her paid duties. "Why do you not leave?" he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "Every nurse before you left within days, some within hours. You have endured worse from me than any of them, and yet you remain." Mara paused in her work, considering the question, with the same careful thoughtfulness she brought to everything else, before finally turning to face him directly, her expression softening into something that looked almost like understanding, shared between two people who recognized the same shape of grief in one another, even without full knowledge of its origin. "Because leaving never truly occurred to me as an option," she said quietly. "Not when someone is suffering, and not when I believe, even in the smallest way, that my presence might ease that suffering even slightly. I learned that lesson somewhere I did not wish to learn it, Your Grace, but I learned it well enough that I do not think I could unlearn it now, even if I tried." He wanted to ask her more, wanted to understand the full weight behind those careful words, but something in her expression told him the rest of the story would come only when she was ready to offer it, not before, and for the first time in longer than he could properly remember, Alaric Glenmara found himself willing to wait patiently for someone else's truth, rather than demanding it be given to him immediately. The question Alaric had asked lingered between them for several days afterward, neither of them raising the subject again directly, though something had shifted quietly in the room since that evening, a fragile trust beginning to take root where only suspicion and exhaustion had existed before. Mara continued her nightly routine with the same steady patience, and Alaric, though still guarded in his words, no longer greeted her arrival each evening with the sharp hostility that had defined their first meetings. It was late one evening, nearly 3 weeks after Mara had first entered his chambers with an armful of linens, that the full weight of his own history finally began spilling out of him, unprompted and unguarded, in the quiet hours when sleep refused to come, and the darkness outside seemed to loosen something in his chest that daylight kept firmly locked away. "My father died in this house," he said suddenly, breaking a long silence as Mara sat mending a small tear in one of his shirts by the light of the fire. "In his study, just down the hall. His heart simply stopped one afternoon, while he was reviewing the estate accounts. I was the one who found him." Mara set her needle down carefully, giving him her full attention without interrupting, sensing that he needed to continue without the pressure of a response weighing on his words. "I had not spoken to him properly in nearly a month before that," Alaric continued, his gaze fixed on the ceiling, as though the memory played out there before him. "We had argued about my engagement, about matters of the estate, foolish things, that seemed important at the time and mean absolutely nothing to me now. I never had the chance to make it right with him. One day he was simply gone, and I inherited everything he left behind, including responsibilities I did not feel prepared to carry. I do not think anyone is ever truly prepared for that kind of loss, no matter how much warning they believe they have received. It was only months later that I first fell ill, he continued, as though her words had given him permission to keep unraveling the thread of his own history. The physicians could not agree on a cause. Some blamed grief itself, as though sorrow alone could waste a body away this thoroughly. Others searched for illness in my blood, in my nerves, in every organ they could examine, and found only confusion in return. I began to wonder, in the darker hours, whether my body had simply decided to follow my father's example, whether some part of me wished it would. Mara's expression remained gentle, free of the alarm or pity that such an admission might have provoked in someone less accustomed to sitting with pain of this depth. "And is that still what you wish?" she asked carefully, "even now?" He considered the question longer than she expected, the fire crackling softly in the silence between them, before finally shaking his head slowly. "I do not know anymore," he admitted. "There were months when I believe I did wish exactly that. It seemed simpler than continuing to exist in a body that had betrayed me so completely, in a house that felt emptier every single day my father had been gone from it." "And your engagement?" Mara asked gently, recalling the mention he had made moments before. "What became of that?" His jaw tightened visibly at the question, and for a moment Mara wondered if she had pushed too far, if this particular wound remained too raw for even his newfound honesty to touch. But after a long pause, he answered anyway, his voice flat with the careful control of someone determined not to let old pain show too clearly on his face. "Lady Beatrice Ashcombe," he said. "We were to be married the following spring, after a proper period of mourning, for my father had passed. She wrote to me perhaps 4 months into my illness, explaining that she could not, in good conscience, commit her future to a man whose health remained so uncertain. She moved to live with relatives near the coast shortly afterward. I have not heard from her since, nor have I sought to." "That must have been a difficult letter to receive," Mara said softly, "on top of everything else you were already carrying." "It confirmed something I had already begun to suspect," Alaric said, his voice hardening slightly, despite his obvious effort to remain composed. "That illness reveals exactly who is willing to remain beside you, and who is not. My father was gone. My fiancée had abandoned any pretense of loyalty the moment my future became inconvenient to her plans. I concluded, not unreasonably I think, that everyone eventually leaves when the difficulty becomes great enough, and I decided it was simpler, less painful, to push people away before they had the chance to prove me right on their own terms." Mara absorbed his words quietly, understanding now the full architecture of the wall he had built around himself, brick by painful brick, over the past 2 years. It was not simple cruelty that had driven away 11 nurses before her, but a desperate, wounded attempt to control the one variable he still could, choosing his own abandonment before fate or other people could choose it for him instead. "I understand something of that instinct," she said after a long moment, her own voice carrying a weight she rarely allowed to surface, "though my reasons were different from yours." Alaric turned his head toward her fully, for the first time since beginning his story, curiosity plain on his tired features. "You have mentioned before that you learned this lesson somewhere you did not wish to learn it," he said. "Will you tell me now what you meant by that?" Mara was quiet for a long moment, her hands stilling on the mending in her lap, before she finally set the fabric aside entirely and met his gaze directly. "I had a younger brother," she began, her voice steady, despite the visible effort it cost her to keep it that way. "His name was Liam. He fell ill 2 years ago, much as you have, though his illness took him far more quickly than yours has taken you. 6 months, from the first symptoms until the end." "I am sorry," Alaric said quietly, and something in his tone told her the words carried genuine weight, rather than the empty courtesy such statements often held. "I sat with him through all of it," Mara continued, her gaze drifting toward the fire, as the memories rose unbidden. "Our parents could not bear to watch him suffer, and in truth, I do not blame them for that. Grief affects people in different ways, and theirs manifested as a kind of paralysis, a need to distance themselves from what they could not fix. But I found I could not do the same. I sat beside him every night, through fevers and pain, and moments when he said things to me he surely did not mean, cruel things born entirely from his own suffering, rather than any true feeling toward me. "How did you bear it?" Alaric asked. Genuine curiosity, replacing the careful guard he usually maintained around such personal questions. "I am not certain I bore it particularly well, in truth," Mara admitted with a small, sad smile. "But I understood, even then, that his anger was never truly meant for me. It was meant for the unfairness of his illness, for the terror of an ending he was far too young to face, for the helplessness of watching his own body fail him, despite everything he tried to do to fight it. I could not fix any of that for him. All I could offer was my presence, my willingness to remain beside him regardless of what he said in his worst moments, and in the end, I believe that presence mattered to him, even if he could rarely find the words to say so directly." "Did he?" Alaric asked quietly. "Find those words, in the end?" Mara's eyes grew bright with unshed tears at the memory, though her voice remained steady as she answered. "In his final hours, yes," she said. "He apologized for every cruel word, thanked me for staying, when everyone else had grown too frightened to remain close, and told me that my presence had been the only thing that made the unbearable feel survivable, even briefly. He died peacefully, in the early morning, with my hand in his." The room fell silent following her words, both of them sitting with the weight of shared grief that, despite its different circumstances, connected them in a way neither had expected when Mara had first walked through his chamber door carrying an armful of forgotten linens. Alaric found himself studying her with new understanding, recognizing now that her steady, unshakable patience was not simply a natural temperament, but a hard-won skill, forged through her own devastating loss, offered to him now, with a generosity he was not entirely certain he deserved. "I have not thanked you," he said finally, breaking the silence with words that clearly did not come easily to him after months of guarded isolation. "For staying, despite everything I have said and done since you arrived. I do not believe I have earned such patience from you, given how I have treated every person who has tried to help me." "You do not need to earn kindness for it to be freely given, Your Grace," Mara said gently. "I did not stay because you deserved patience more than the others who came before me. I stayed because I recognized, in your suffering, something I had already learned how to sit beside without flinching away from it." Alaric absorbed her words carefully, something loosening in his chest that had remained tightly wound for far longer than he could properly measure. He did not respond immediately, uncertain what words could possibly match the weight of what she had just offered him, and instead simply reached out, tentatively, to rest his hand briefly over hers where it lay on the edge of the bed, a small gesture that carried more significance than either of them fully acknowledged in that quiet, firelit moment. "Thank you," he said again, more simply this time, and Mara allowed herself a small, genuine smile in response, the first true warmth she had shown him since her arrival at Glenmara Manor nearly a month before. Neither of them spoke further that night about what this shared vulnerability might mean for whatever came next, both too cautious, too accustomed to guarding themselves against further loss, to name the fragile connection forming quietly between them. But something had undeniably changed in that room, some barrier finally beginning to crack after 2 long years of careful, deliberate isolation, and as Mara eventually rose to bank the fire and prepare for the long night ahead, Alaric watched her movements with an attention that had nothing to do with monitoring his own fever, and everything to do with a slowly reawakening part of himself he had believed permanently lost. The weeks that followed brought a change to Glenmara Manor that the older servants scarcely believed possible after everything the house had endured. Alaric began rising from his bed for short periods each day, first only to sit in the chair beside the window, then eventually to walk the length of his chamber, with Mara's steady arm offered for support whenever his strength faltered. His appetite continued to improve, his color returning gradually to something closer to health, and the fevers that had once plagued him nightly grew farther apart, milder each time they returned. Mrs. Pratt watched these changes with quiet astonishment, though she said little about it beyond ensuring that Mara received whatever supplies or assistance she required to continue her work. The younger housemaids, who had once whispered fearfully about the East Wing, now spoke instead with a kind of wondering curiosity about the transformation taking place there, though none dared approach closely enough to witness it directly. Only Constance the cook, who prepared the increasingly hearty meals now requested from the Duke's chambers, seemed to fully grasp the scale of what was happening, remarking more than once that she had not prepared a proper roast for his grace in over a year, until Mara had begun requesting one on his behalf. Not everyone in the household greeted this recovery with unreserved joy, however. Mr. Corwin Vale, the estate's longtime steward, had grown accustomed over the past 2 years to managing Glenmara's affairs, with minimal interference from a duke too ill and too withdrawn to concern himself with the details of his own holdings. Vale had handled the accounts, the tenant agreements, the daily business of the estate almost entirely according to his own judgment, and a fully recovered duke, alert and engaged once more in his own affairs, represented a return to oversight that Vale had quietly come to resent the idea of. Vale first noticed the changes during one of his regular visits to deliver estate documents for the Duke's signature, a task that had become largely ceremonial in recent months, given how rarely Alaric had the strength or the interest to review what he signed. He arrived that particular afternoon to find the Duke sitting upright in a chair by the window, rather than buried beneath blankets in his bed, reading through the tenant reports with a sharpness of attention Vale had not witnessed from him in well over a year. "Your Grace appears much improved," Vale said carefully, masking whatever unease he felt behind a carefully neutral tone as he handed over the latest documents. "I am improving, yes," Alaric replied, scanning the pages before him with visible interest, rather than the distracted indifference Vale had grown used to relying upon. "I find I have questions about these tenant arrangements from the northern fields, Vale. The figures here do not match what I recall from my father's records." Vale's expression flickered almost imperceptibly, though he recovered quickly, offering a smooth explanation about adjustments made during the transition of management following the old Duke's death. Alaric accepted the explanation for the moment, though something in his tone suggested he intended to examine the matter further once his strength allowed for a more thorough review, and Vale departed the chamber with a carefully composed face masking a growing unease about what a fully alert Duke might eventually discover in the accounts he had managed so freely during the long months of illness. Mara, present in the room throughout this exchange as she often was now, said nothing about the tension she had sensed between the two men, though she filed the observation away quietly, the same instinct for reading unspoken currents that had first drawn her toward the Duke's suffering, now alerting her to something less obviously benevolent stirring beneath the surface of the household's daily operations. That evening, once Vale had departed and the house had settled into its familiar quiet, Alaric mentioned the exchange to Mara as she helped him prepare for the night's rest, his brow furrowed with the particular focus of a man whose mind, after months of illness dulled clarity, had begun sharpening once again toward matters he had long neglected. "Something about those figures troubles me," he said, setting aside the tenant reports Vale had left behind. "I do not wish to accuse a man who has managed this estate faithfully for years, without proper cause, but I find myself wanting to examine the accounts more closely than I have had strength for until now." "Trust your instincts, Your Grace," Mara said simply, folding a fresh blanket over the foot of his bed. "You know this estate and its history better than anyone else remaining in this house. If something appears wrong to you, it likely deserves closer attention." "You do not know Vale," Alaric said, though there was no real argument in his tone, more a kind of thinking aloud than genuine disagreement. "He has served this family for over a decade. My father trusted him completely." "Trust earned in the past does not guarantee honesty in the present," Mara observed carefully. "Though I do not know the man well enough to judge him fairly, one way or another, I only encourage you to look closely at whatever troubles you, rather than dismissing your own concerns, simply because trust once existed." Alaric considered her words thoughtfully, recognizing in them the same quiet wisdom she had offered him about so many other matters since her arrival. He said nothing further that evening about the tenant accounts, though the seed of concern had been planted firmly enough that he found himself, over the following days, requesting additional records from Vale, under the guise of simple curiosity about the estate's recent history, quietly building a clearer picture of exactly how the property had been managed during the long period of his own incapacity. Meanwhile, the bond between Alaric and Mara continued deepening in ways that extended well beyond the practical necessities of his care. He began looking forward to her evening arrivals with an eagerness he could not quite disguise, finding himself asking after her day, her thoughts, her small opinions on matters ranging from the books he had begun reading again to the changing weather over the hills surrounding the manor. Mara, in turn, found herself sharing small pieces of her life more freely than she had with anyone since her brother's passing, describing the village of her childhood, the small kindnesses of neighbors who had helped her family through difficult seasons, the simple pleasures she had once taken in walking through meadows now left far behind her. One particularly clear afternoon, with his strength sufficiently improved and Dr. Hale's cautious approval secured, Alaric requested that Mara accompany him on a short walk through the manor's private gardens, the first time he had ventured beyond his own chamber walls in nearly a year. The gardens, though somewhat overgrown from months of neglect, still held traces of their former beauty. Rose bushes, climbing wild along stone walls, a small fountain standing silent and dry near the garden's center, paths winding beneath trees that had grown heavy with summer leaves during his long confinement indoors. He walked slowly, leaning on a cane Dr. Hale had recommended for additional support, with Mara close beside him, ready to steady him, should his strength falter unexpectedly. The fresh air seemed to work some quiet magic on his spirits, his expression softening as he took in the familiar landscape of his childhood home, from a perspective he had not experienced in far too long. "I used to play here as a boy," he said, gesturing toward a particularly large oak tree near the garden's edge. "My father would sit beneath that tree reading his correspondence, while I ran through the paths pretending to be some great explorer, discovering new lands. It seems a very long time ago now." "It is a beautiful garden," Mara said, genuine admiration in her voice, as she took in the tangled roses and the ivy climbing the old stone walls. "Even overgrown as it is, I can see how lovely it must have been in better days." "It could be lovely again," Alaric said thoughtfully, with proper care and attention. "I had forgotten, I think, that such things were still possible until quite recently." He glanced toward her as he spoke, and Mara understood, without either of them stating it directly, that his words carried meaning well beyond the simple state of the garden paths before them. Something in his tone suggested a man rediscovering hope itself, cautiously, tentatively, after 2 years of believing such a feeling permanently beyond his reach, and Mara felt her own heart respond to that quiet rediscovery with a warmth she had not allowed herself to feel toward anyone since long before her arrival at Glenmara Manor. They walked together in comfortable silence for a while longer, the afternoon sun warming the stone paths beneath their feet, until Alaric's strength began to wane, and they turned back toward the house, his pace slower now, but his spirits noticeably lighter than when they had begun their walk. As they approached the manor's entrance, however, they encountered Vale standing near the doorway, in conversation with a well-dressed man Mara did not recognize, both of their expressions shifting subtly at the sight of the Duke, walking under his own power, through the gardens for the first time in over a year. "Your Grace," the unfamiliar man said, stepping forward with a smile that did not quite reach his eyes. "What a pleasure to see you looking so well. I had heard rumors of your improved health, though I confess I did not fully believe them until witnessing this myself." "Cousin Percival," Alaric said, his tone carrying a careful neutrality that suggested a relationship far more complicated than simple family warmth. "I was not aware you intended to visit Glenmara this season." "I thought it only proper to check on your welfare," Percival replied smoothly, "given the concerning reports I had received about your condition in recent months. I am relieved to find those reports apparently exaggerated." Mara watched this exchange carefully, noting the careful tension beneath the polite surface conversation. The way Vale's expression remained studiously neutral, while Percival's eyes traveled assessingly over the Duke's recovering frame, as though calculating something Mara could not fully identify but instinctively distrusted. She said nothing, remaining quietly beside Alaric as protocol demanded, though she filed away this new arrival and his obvious alliance with the steward as another thread in the growing pattern of concern she had begun sensing beneath the surface calm of Glenmara Manor's daily operations. Percival Glenmara remained at the manor for 3 days following that first encounter in the garden, occupying one of the guest chambers and making frequent appearances at meals and in common areas where he might cross paths with the recovering Duke. He spoke often of family duty and concern for Alaric's well-being, offering flattering observations about the improvement in his cousin's health, Though Mara noticed how his questions consistently circled back toward matters of the estate's finances, the tenant arrangements, and the general state of Glenmara's holdings, framed always as innocent curiosity, rather than anything more calculated. Alaric, though weakened still by his long illness, had not lost the sharp instincts that had once made him a capable heir to his father's estate before sickness had stolen those years from him. He answered Percival's questions with careful vagueness, offering little real information while appearing outwardly cooperative, and Mara admired the quiet skill with which he navigated these conversations, recognizing perhaps for the first time since her arrival the intelligent, capable man who existed beneath the illness that had so thoroughly overshadowed him. "Your cousin asks a great many questions about matters that seem, on the surface, quite unrelated to concern for your health," Mara observed one evening, once Percival had retired to his chamber, and the house had settled into its familiar quiet. "Percival has always had an interest in Glenmara's fortunes that exceeds simple family affection," Alaric replied, his tone carrying a weary cynicism that suggested long familiarity with his cousin's true motivations. "He stands to inherit the title and estate, should I die without an heir of my own, a fact he has never been particularly subtle about keeping in mind, even during the years when my father was alive, and such an inheritance seemed a distant, unlikely possibility." "And now that you have improved," Mara said carefully, "his interest in your welfare appears to have increased rather than diminished." "Precisely," Alaric said, a faint, humorless smile touching his lips. "A dying duke represents an inheritance, nearly secured. A recovering one represents an inheritance, suddenly in question, and Percival has never been a man to accept uncertainty gracefully when it threatens something he has already begun to consider his own." Mara considered this information carefully, connecting it in her mind to the tension she had already noticed between Alaric and his steward regarding the tenant accounts. "Do you believe," she asked slowly, "that Mr. Vale and your cousin might share some common interest in your continued illness, rather than your recovery?" Alaric's expression grew more serious at this question, clearly one he had already begun considering himself in recent days. "I do not wish to accuse either man without proper evidence," he said carefully, "but I have noticed that Vale's discomfort with my improved health seems to mirror Percival's rather closely. It would not surprise me to learn they have maintained some correspondence over these past months, sharing information about my condition that neither had any proper reason to discuss between themselves." The following morning brought further confirmation of these suspicions, when Alaric, now strong enough to spend several hours each day reviewing estate documents, with a clarity of mind he had not possessed in over a year, discovered discrepancies in the tenant accounts that went beyond simple administrative confusion. Payments recorded as made to certain tenant families did not match the amounts those families had actually received, according to careful inquiries Alaric made through a trusted older servant who maintained connections throughout the surrounding farms. The difference, though not enormous in any single transaction, accumulated over many months into a sum substantial enough to raise serious questions about where the missing funds had actually gone. He shared these findings with Mara that evening, his expression troubled as he laid out the pattern of discrepancies across several sheets of paper spread before him. "I believe Vale has been diverting portions of the tenant payments for his own benefit," he said grimly, "using my illness and inattention as cover for the arrangement. I cannot yet prove the full extent of it, but the pattern is too consistent to be simple error." "What will you do?" Mara asked, watching his face carefully for signs of the exhaustion that such stressful discoveries might provoke in someone still recovering his full strength. "I must gather clearer evidence before I make any accusation," Alaric said, though determination had replaced the weary resignation that had characterized his manner for so long before Mara's arrival. "But I intend to see this matter resolved properly, regardless of how long Vale has served this family, or how comfortable he has grown, assuming I would never recover enough to notice his arrangements." Mara felt a quiet pride swell in her chest at witnessing this transformation, the return of a man capable of managing his own affairs, defending his own interests, standing firm against those who had sought to profit from his suffering. She said little in response, understanding that this particular battle belonged to Alaric alone to navigate, though she remained close beside him throughout the following days as he quietly gathered further evidence, reviewing old correspondence, questioning tenant families discreetly through intermediaries he trusted, building a case methodical enough to withstand whatever denials Vale might offer once confronted. Percival departed the manor at the end of his third day, offering warm farewells and repeated assurances of his continued concern for Alaric's welfare, though something in his manner as he left suggested a man who had gathered whatever information he had come seeking, and intended to make use of it in whatever way best served his own interests going forward. Mara watched his carriage depart down the long gravel drive with a lingering unease she could not entirely shake, sensing that this visit represented not a resolution of the tension surrounding Glenmara's future, but merely the opening movement of a longer, more complicated conflict still to come. That evening, once the house had quieted following Percival's departure, Alaric and Mara sat together in the private sitting room adjoining his chamber, a space he had begun using in recent weeks, as his strength allowed him greater freedom of movement beyond his bed. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting warm light across the room, and for a while, neither of them spoke, simply enjoying the peaceful quiet that had become such a rare commodity in recent days. "I have been thinking," Alaric said finally, breaking the comfortable silence, "about how different this house feels now compared to when you first arrived. I do not believe I properly understood, until recently, how completely I had surrendered to my own despair before you came into my life. You were fighting a difficult battle alone," Mara said gently. "It is no shame to have struggled beneath that weight." "Perhaps not," he acknowledged, "but I recognize now how close I came to losing that battle entirely. Not necessarily to the illness itself, but to the isolation and bitterness I allowed to consume whatever strength I had left. You changed that, Mara. Not through any medicine or treatment, but simply through your willingness to remain beside me when everyone else, myself included, had already given up hope of my recovery." Mara felt her cheeks warm slightly at the sincerity in his words, unaccustomed still to receiving such direct gratitude after weeks of careful, guarded interactions between them. "I did very little beyond what any decent person would do," she said modestly, though something in his expression told her he would not accept such simple deflection of the credit he clearly wished to offer her. "You did far more than that," he insisted quietly. "You reminded me that I was still worth caring for, even at my very worst, even when I gave you every reason to abandon that care, as everyone before you eventually had. I do not know how I will ever properly repay such a gift, Mara, but I intend to try, in whatever ways remain within my power." The moment stretched between them, charged with an understanding neither had yet spoken aloud directly, though both recognized clearly enough the deepening bond that had formed between healer and patient over these past weeks of shared vulnerability and quiet trust. Mara said nothing further in response, simply reaching out to rest her hand gently over his where it lay on the arm of his chair, and Alaric turned his hand beneath hers to clasp it properly, both of them sitting together in comfortable silence, as the fire burned low and the house settled into peaceful night around them, unaware of the challenges still gathering on the horizon that would soon test the strength of everything they had carefully built together. Dr. Edmund Hale arrived for his scheduled visit 3 days after Percival's departure, and the examination he conducted that afternoon left him visibly moved by what he found. Alaric's pulse had steadied to something approaching normal strength. His color had returned to a healthy warmth, rather than the pale gray that had marked him for so many months, and the weight he had gained since Mara's arrival had filled out the hollows in his face and frame that illness had carved so deeply. "I confess, Your Grace," the doctor said, folding his stethoscope back into his bag with an expression of genuine wonder. "I did not expect to witness this level of recovery when I first began treating you 18 months ago. Whatever combination of factors has brought about this change, I would strongly encourage you to continue it without interruption." "I owe a great deal of this recovery to Mara," Alaric said simply, glancing toward where she stood near the window, having just finished tidying the room before the doctor's arrival. "Her care these past weeks has accomplished what no medicine alone seemed capable of achieving." Dr. Hale turned toward Mara with evident curiosity, studying her for a long moment with the assessing eye of a man accustomed to observing the subtle details others might overlook. "You have no formal medical training, I understand," he said, not unkindly, though with clear professional interest in understanding what exactly had produced such remarkable results. "None, sir," Mara admitted. "Only what I learned nursing my own brother through his illness some years ago." "Whatever you learned during that experience," Hale said thoughtfully, "you have applied here with results that exceed what most trained nurses manage to achieve. I would go so far as to say that His Grace's recovery over these past weeks represents the most significant improvement I have witnessed in 18 months of treating this case. I strongly recommend that this arrangement continue, and that this household recognize the value of what has been accomplished here, rather than treating it as some temporary or informal solution. His words carried weight beyond their simple content, an implicit endorsement that Mara had not sought, but that settled something uncertain in her position at Glenmara Manor, transforming her from an unlikely, temporary substitute into someone whose contribution deserved formal recognition within the household structure. Mrs. Pratt, present during this exchange to assist with the doctor's visit, absorbed this recommendation with a thoughtful nod, clearly already considering how such recognition might be properly arranged going forward. News of Dr. Hale's assessment spread through the household staff by the following morning, and with it came a shift in how the other servants regarded Mara, the quiet scullery maid who had somehow accomplished what 11 trained nurses had failed to achieve. Where suspicion and fearful curiosity had once colored their glances toward her, something closer to respect and genuine warmth began replacing it, the younger maids seeking her out with small questions about the Duke's care, the older staff offering nods of acknowledgement that had not been extended to her during her first uncertain weeks in the house. Not everyone welcomed this shift in status, however. Mr. Vale, already unsettled by the Duke's returning sharpness of mind regarding the estate's finances, watched Mara's rising influence within the household with a wariness that bordered on genuine alarm. He understood, perhaps more clearly than anyone else at Glenmara, that a fully recovered Duke represented the end of the freedom he had enjoyed managing the estate's affairs with minimal oversight, and he began to view Mara not merely as an unlikely nurse who had assisted in that recovery, but as the direct catalyst for a change that threatened his own comfortable position. Vale's concerns found a receptive audience when Percival returned to Glenmara barely a week after his previous visit, this time under the pretense of discussing certain family matters related to an aging aunt's inheritance, though the true purpose of his visit became clear soon enough, in a private conversation held between the two men in the estate's study, a conversation neither realized had been partially overheard by a young footman passing through the adjoining corridor. "The Duke grows stronger by the week," Percival said, his earlier pleasant manner replaced by something considerably harder, now that only Vale remained to witness it. "If this recovery continues at its current pace, he will soon possess both the strength and the sharpness of mind to examine every aspect of this estate's management in detail. I trust you understand what that examination might reveal, given the arrangements you and I have maintained these past many months." "I am aware of the risk," Vale replied tersely. "The maid is responsible for this change. Before her arrival, His Grace showed no interest in recovery, no strength to pursue such interest, even had he possessed it. She has undone 18 months of natural decline in a matter of weeks." "Then perhaps," Percival said slowly, an idea clearly forming behind his calculating expression, "the solution lies in removing the source of this inconvenient recovery, rather than waiting to see how thoroughly it might eventually threaten both our interests." The footman who overheard this fragment of conversation, a young man named Tobias who had grown fond of Mara during her weeks in the household, said nothing immediately, uncertain of the full implications of what he had heard, but troubled enough by the tone of the exchange to mention it quietly to Mrs. Pratt later that same evening, once his duties had concluded, and he found a private moment to approach her. Mrs. Pratt listened to Tobias's account with growing concern, recognizing immediately the danger such a conversation implied for both Mara's position and, perhaps more significantly, for the Duke's own safety and well-being should these two men decide that more direct action was required to protect their financial interests. She resolved to share this information carefully, first with Mara herself, and then, depending on Mara's judgment of the situation, with Alaric as well, understanding that any accusation against a cousin and a longtime steward would require careful handling to avoid dismissal as mere servant gossip or exaggeration. She found Mara in the small linen room adjoining the kitchens the following morning, sorting through fresh supplies for the Duke's chambers, and drew her aside with a seriousness that immediately caught Mara's full attention. "I must share something troubling with you," Mrs. Pratt said quietly, glancing around to ensure no other servants remained within hearing distance. "Tobias overheard a conversation yesterday between Mr. Vale and Mr. Percival that concerns me a great deal, particularly given your position in this household and the Duke's continued recovery." She relayed the fragment of conversation as Tobias had described it, watching Mara's expression carefully as the implications settled into place. Mara's face remained composed, though something hardened behind her calm exterior as she absorbed the clear threat contained within those overheard words. A threat aimed not merely at her own position within the household, but potentially at the very safety of the man she had spent these past weeks so carefully nursing back toward health. "They mean to remove me somehow," Mara said slowly, working through the implications with the same careful thoroughness she brought to every difficult problem. "Whether through dismissal, or through some more direct means, I cannot yet be certain. But their concern is clearly that my continued presence threatens whatever financial arrangement Mr. Vale has been maintaining during his Grace's illness." "You must tell him," Mrs. Pratt said firmly. "Whatever risk exists to your own position, His Grace deserves to know that his cousin and his steward may be conspiring against both his financial interests and, potentially, his very recovery itself." Mara nodded slowly, understanding the necessity of the conversation ahead, even as she recognized the delicate nature of accusing a family member and a longtime servant of such serious wrongdoing, particularly given her own precarious position as an outsider who had risen unexpectedly from scullery maid to trusted caregiver within the space of only a few weeks. She thanked Mrs. Pratt for bringing this information forward, and resolved to share it with Alaric that very evening, understanding that whatever conflict lay ahead would require both careful strategy and unwavering courage from both of them, if they hoped to protect not only the truth of the estate's finances, but the fragile new life Alaric had only just begun rebuilding for himself, after so many months of darkness and despair. Mara chose her moment carefully that evening, waiting until Alaric had finished his supper and settled comfortably into the chair beside his fireplace, before raising the difficult subject that Mrs. Pratt had brought to her attention. She had spent the intervening hours considering how best to present such serious information without appearing to overstate her own importance to the household, or to cast unfounded suspicion on men who had, after all, served the Glenmara family for many years before her own arrival. "There is something I must tell you," she began, sitting across from him with a seriousness that immediately drew his full attention away from the book he had been reading. "Something concerning Mr. Vale and your cousin Percival, overheard by one of the footmen during Percival's most recent visit." She relayed the conversation exactly as Mrs. Pratt had described it, watching Alaric's expression shift from initial skepticism to growing alarm as the full weight of the implications settled over him. His hands tightened on the arms of his chair, the color that had returned to his face over these past weeks, draining slightly as he absorbed what she was telling him. "They spoke of removing the source of my recovery," he repeated slowly, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. "They spoke of you, Mara, as an inconvenience to be eliminated, rather than a person whose care has saved my life these past weeks." "I do not know precisely what they intend," Mara said carefully, "whether dismissal from this household or something more direct and troubling. But given what you have already discovered about the tenant accounts, and given Percival's clear interest in your continued illness, rather than your recovery, I believe we must take this threat seriously." Alaric rose from his chair, pacing the length of the room with an energy that surprised even himself, his mind working quickly through the implications of what he had just learned. "Vale has managed this estate's finances for years," he said, thinking aloud as much as addressing Mara directly. "If he has indeed been diverting funds during my illness, and if Percival has been aware of, and perhaps even encouraging that arrangement, in hopes of inheriting a weakened, mismanaged estate, then my recovery threatens far more than simple oversight of the accounts. It threatens to expose a conspiracy that could see both men facing serious consequences, which gives them significant motivation to prevent that recovery from continuing," Mara said quietly, "or to remove anyone they perceive as responsible for it." The gravity of the situation settled over both of them in the quiet that followed, the fire crackling softly, as Alaric continued to process the full scope of the threat they now faced together. He stopped his pacing eventually, turning to face Mara directly, his expression hardening into something resembling the determined resolve she had witnessed weeks earlier, when he first began investigating the tenant account discrepancies. "I will not allow them to harm you," he said firmly, "nor will I allow them to continue exploiting this estate and its tenants for their own benefit. But we must proceed carefully. An accusation without solid evidence could be dismissed as the ravings of a still recovering invalid, or worse, as an attempt by an ambitious servant to discredit her betters. We need proof, Mara, clear enough that no one could reasonably dispute it. Over the following days, Alaric worked with renewed urgency to gather the evidence he needed, drawing on the discrepancies he had already identified in the tenant accounts, and expanding his investigation to include correspondence between Vale and various tenant families, records of payments that did not match what those families confirmed actually receiving, and eventually, through careful inquiry, conducted by a trusted solicitor in the nearby town, evidence of a private account Vale had maintained separately from the estate's official records, containing sums that corresponded suspiciously well with the missing tenant payments accumulated over many months. Mara, meanwhile, remained cautious in her daily movements around the house, aware that whatever plan Vale and Percival might be considering could manifest in ways both subtle and direct. She avoided situations that left her alone with either man, kept Mrs. Pratt informed of her whereabouts throughout each day, and continued her care of Alaric with the same steady dedication that had defined her weeks at Glenmara, refusing to allow fear to diminish the quality of attention she offered him, despite the very real danger now shadowing her position within the household. The confrontation, when it finally came, arrived sooner than either Alaric or Mara had anticipated. Vale, perhaps sensing the increased scrutiny directed toward the estate's accounts, requested an urgent meeting with the Duke barely a week after Mara had first shared her concerning information. Arriving at the appointed hour, with a stack of documents he claimed would clarify certain irregularities that had apparently come to his attention through routine review of the records. Alaric received him in the same private sitting room where he had first learned of Vale's suspected treachery, with Mara present, at his specific request, her role as witness to the conversation, deliberately established beforehand to ensure no version of events could later be disputed or reframed to her disadvantage. Vale's expression flickered with visible unease at finding her present, though he recovered quickly, launching into a carefully prepared explanation of the discrepancies Alaric had identified, attributing them to clerical errors, misunderstandings with tenant families, and the general confusion that had accompanied the transition of estate management following the previous Duke's sudden death. These explanations do not account for the private account maintained under a name closely resembling your own, Mr. Vale, Alaric said calmly, once the steward had finished his lengthy justification, producing the solicitor's findings with a steadiness that belied the anger simmering just beneath his composed exterior. Nor do they explain why the sums deposited into that account correspond so precisely with the payments missing from the tenant records over these past 18 months. Vale's carefully maintained composure finally cracked at this direct confrontation, his face paling as he realized the full extent of what the Duke had already uncovered. He attempted several more explanations, each less convincing than the last, before finally falling silent, the weight of the evidence before him making further denial impossible to sustain credibly. Your cousin was aware of this arrangement, Vale said finally, a desperate attempt to distribute blame, rather than accept it fully himself. He encouraged the diversion of funds, believing your illness would soon claim your life regardless, and that a weakened estate would matter little once he inherited it entirely. I intend to address my cousin's involvement separately, Alaric said coldly, though your own culpability remains undiminished by whatever role Percival played in encouraging your dishonesty. I will be informing the local magistrate of these findings, Mr. Vale, and you will vacate your position at Glenmara Manor immediately, pending whatever legal consequences this investigation ultimately determines are warranted. The confrontation ended, with Vale's hasty departure from both the room and, within hours, the estate itself, though the matter did not conclude there entirely. Percival, upon learning of Vale's exposure through channels neither Alaric nor Mara ever fully identified, arrived at Glenmara the following day, in a state of barely controlled fury, demanding to speak with his cousin privately, regarding what he termed baseless accusations against his character and reputation. Alaric, however, refused to meet him without witnesses present, insisting that Mara remain in the room throughout their entire conversation, despite Percival's visible objection to her presence. Whatever you have to say to me, cousin, Alaric said firmly, you may say in front of the woman whose care saved my life these past weeks, and whose safety you apparently discussed compromising in conversation with Mr. Vale. Percival's face reddened at this direct reference to the overheard conversation, and for a long moment he seemed prepared to deny everything outright, before finally, recognizing the futility of continued denial given the evidence Alaric had already assembled against Vale. He shifted instead toward a defensive justification of his own involvement, claiming ignorance of the specific financial arrangements while admitting, reluctantly, to hoping for the estate's eventual passage into his own hands, given what he had believed to be Alaric's inevitable decline. I hoped for nothing more than what circumstances seemed destined to provide, regardless of my own actions, Percival said stiffly. If Vale chose to enrich himself during that period, that arrangement was between him and his own conscience, not something I actively orchestrated or encouraged. Your conversation with Mr. Vale suggests otherwise, Alaric replied, his tone carrying a coldness that left no doubt about the depth of betrayal he felt from a man he had once considered, however distantly, a member of his own family. I will not pursue formal legal action against you, cousin, out of whatever remaining respect I hold for our family connection. But you are no longer welcome at Glenmara Manor, and I expect you will find little warmth remaining in whatever relationship we once maintained between us. Percival departed shortly afterward, his composure thoroughly shattered, his hopes of an easy inheritance dismantled entirely by the very recovery he had so desperately hoped to prevent, through whatever means necessary. Mara watched his departure from the window of the sitting room, a quiet sense of relief settling over her now that the immediate threat to both her safety and Alaric's financial interests had been so thoroughly resolved, though she understood that the true victory of these past difficult weeks lay not merely in exposing Vale's dishonesty or Percival's opportunism, but in the strength and clarity Alaric had rediscovered within himself throughout the process of confronting them both. In the days following Percival's departure and Vale's disgrace, a new sense of order began settling over Glenmara Manor, one that extended well beyond the practical matters of estate management, now that a trusted new steward, recommended by the same solicitor who had helped uncover Vale's wrongdoing, had begun the careful work of restoring proper accounting practices throughout the property. Alaric threw himself into these efforts with an energy that continued to astonish those who remembered the withdrawn, despairing man he had been only months earlier, reviewing tenant agreements personally, meeting with local farmers to address grievances that had accumulated during Vale's mismanagement, and gradually reclaiming the full responsibilities of his title that his long illness had forced him to abandon. Mara watched this transformation with quiet pride, continuing her care of his physical health, even as his need for constant nursing attention diminished with each passing week. His fevers had disappeared entirely by this point, his strength sufficient now for full days of activity, rather than the brief periods he had once managed only with significant effort, and Dr. Hale, during his increasingly infrequent visits, offered nothing but praise for the remarkable recovery he continued to witness. I believe, Your Grace, Dr. Hale said during what would prove to be one of his final formal visits, that you have moved well beyond the need for daily medical supervision. Your recovery these past months represents something I will remember for the remainder of my career. A case that defied every expectation I held when I first began treating you 18 months ago. I owe that recovery to more than medicine alone, Alaric said, glancing toward where Mara stood near the window, a gesture that had become familiar to everyone in the household who witnessed the deep bond that had formed between the Duke and the woman who had first entered his chamber, as nothing more than a scullery maid, delivering forgotten linens. With his health fully restored, and the threat of Vale and Percival's schemes thoroughly resolved, Alaric found himself confronting a new question that had been quietly forming in his mind for weeks, one that concerned not the management of his estate, or the state of his physical health, but the future he hoped to build alongside the woman who had so completely transformed both. He began seeking opportunities to speak with Mara privately, away from the daily routines of estate business and household management, conversations that gradually shifted from practical matters toward something deeper and more personal than either had allowed themselves to fully acknowledge during the earlier, more precarious weeks of his recovery. One particularly warm afternoon, as summer settled fully over the hills surrounding Glenmara, Alaric requested that Mara join him for a walk through the gardens, now restored to something approaching their former beauty through the efforts of a newly hired gardener working under Alaric's careful direction. The overgrown paths had been cleared, the rose bushes pruned back into elegant order, and the dry fountain at the garden's center had been repaired, and set flowing once more, its gentle sound providing a peaceful accompaniment to their unhurried walk through the grounds. "I have been thinking a great deal these past weeks," Alaric began, as they paused near the fountain, watching the water catch the afternoon sunlight in gentle, sparkling arcs, "about everything that has changed since your arrival at this house. I was a man who had given up entirely on the possibility of recovery, of happiness, of any future beyond simple survival through each difficult day. You changed all of that, Mara, not through any dramatic gesture, but simply through your steady, unwavering presence when everyone else, myself included, had already surrendered hope." "I only did what seemed right," Mara said softly, though she recognized the deeper significance building beneath his words. A conversation moving toward territory neither of them had yet dared to name directly, despite the clear affection that had grown between them over these many months. "You did far more than what seemed simply right," Alaric continued, turning to face her fully, his expression carrying a vulnerability she had rarely seen from him even during their most difficult early weeks together. "You gave me back my life, Mara, in every sense that matters. My health, certainly, but also my sense of purpose, my connection to this estate, and the people who depend upon it, and perhaps most significantly, my belief that I remained worthy of care and affection, despite everything illness and betrayal had convinced me to believe about myself." Mara felt her heart quicken at the weight of his words, understanding now with complete clarity where this conversation was leading, though she remained quiet, allowing him the space to continue at his own pace, toward whatever declaration he was working to find the courage for. "I love you," Alaric said finally, the words carrying a simple directness that contrasted sharply with the careful, guarded manner he had maintained through so much of their early acquaintance. "I have loved you, I believe, for longer than I have properly allowed myself to acknowledge, uncertain whether such feelings were fair to place upon someone hired initially to nurse me through illness, rather than to receive declarations of affection from a man still finding his way back to full health. But I can no longer keep this feeling silent, Mara. I love you, and I wish, more than anything else this recovered life has offered me, to build a future together, if you would consider sharing that future with a man who owes you everything he has become since your arrival at this house." Mara's eyes filled with tears at the sincerity of his declaration, her own feelings, carefully guarded through weeks of professional caution and quiet uncertainty about her place within his life, finally finding release in this moment of shared vulnerability beside the newly restored fountain. "I love you as well," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly with the emotion of finally speaking words she had held close for longer than she had fully admitted even to herself. "I did not come to this house seeking such feelings, Alaric, nor did I expect them when I first entered your chamber, carrying nothing more than an armful of forgotten linens. But I have watched you fight your way back from despair, with a courage that has moved me more deeply than I know how to properly express, and I would be honored beyond words to share whatever future lies ahead of us together." Alaric reached for her hands, his own trembling slightly with an emotion that had nothing to do with lingering illness, and everything to do with the profound joy of finally speaking a truth he had carried quietly for weeks. "Then will you consider becoming my wife?" he asked, his voice carrying both hope and lingering uncertainty, despite everything Mara had just confirmed about her own feelings. "Not as my nurse, nor as my servant, but as my equal partner in whatever remains ahead of us, sharing both the responsibilities and the joys that come with rebuilding this estate and this family's legacy together?" "Yes," Mara answered without hesitation, joy breaking across her features in a way that transformed her usually composed expression into something radiant and unguarded. "Yes, Alaric, I will marry you, and I will build whatever future lies ahead of us together, gladly and without reservation." The engagement that followed spread quickly through the household staff, greeted with a genuine warmth that spoke to how thoroughly Mara had earned the affection and respect of everyone at Glenmara Manor during her months of quiet, dedicated service. Mrs. Pratt, who had first sent Mara up to the East Wing with nothing more than an armful of linens and no expectation of the profound change that small errand would set into motion, wept openly upon hearing the news, embracing Mara with a warmth that acknowledged the remarkable journey they had shared together since that uncertain first day of Mara's arrival at the manor. News of the engagement traveled beyond the household as well, through the surrounding county, and eventually reaching the ears of Lady Beatrice Ashcombe, whose earlier abandonment of Alaric during his darkest days had left such a lasting wound upon his heart. She sent a brief letter of congratulations upon learning of his recovery and engagement, though Alaric read it with a distant equanimity that suggested the pain of her earlier betrayal had finally, fully healed, replaced entirely by the deeper, more genuine connection he had found with the woman whose quiet strength had never once wavered throughout his most difficult trials. As preparations began for what promised to be Glenmara Manor's first joyful celebration, in longer than most of the household staff could properly remember, Mara found herself reflecting on the strange, unexpected path that had brought her to this moment, from a grieving sister nursing her dying brother through his final months, to a quiet scullery maid answering an ordinary advertisement in a northern village newspaper, to the future duchess of an estate she had once been forbidden even to approach. She understood now, with a clarity that only such a remarkable journey could provide, that the courage to remain present through another's suffering, however difficult that presence might prove in its most challenging moments, carried within it the power to transform not only the person receiving that care, but the very course of one's own future as well. The wedding took place on a bright autumn morning, several months after Alaric's proposal beside the restored fountain, timed carefully to allow his full physical recovery to be complete and unquestionable, before the celebration that would formally unite him with Mara before the entire county. Glenmara Manor, which had stood shadowed and quiet for so many long months during the darkest period of his illness, transformed for the occasion into something resembling the grand, joyful house it had once been during his father's lifetime. Garlands of autumn flowers decorating the halls, the long-neglected ballroom polished and prepared for celebration for the first time in over 2 years. Mara stood before her wedding day with a mixture of joy and quiet disbelief at how completely her life had changed since that first uncertain journey to Glenmara Manor, carrying nothing more than a small cloth bag and a willingness to work hard at whatever position awaited her. She had come seeking simple employment, a modest position, far below the grand halls she now prepared to call her permanent home, and instead had found a love that neither illness, nor betrayal, nor the scheming of those who wished to profit from another's suffering had managed to prevent from taking root and flourishing. The ceremony itself was modest by the standards of the aristocracy, reflecting both Alaric's continued preference for quiet simplicity following his long recovery, and Mara's own humble origins, which she had never sought to hide or apologize for, despite her elevation to a position of such significant social standing. Local tenants and farmers, whose grievances Alaric had personally addressed following Vale's disgrace, attended alongside members of the county's more established families, creating a gathering that reflected the genuine, broad-based respect Alaric had rebuilt for himself throughout his remarkable recovery, and the careful stewardship he had since demonstrated over his family's estate. Mrs. Pratt, seated near the front of the modest chapel where the ceremony took place, watched the proceedings with tears streaming freely down her weathered cheeks, remembering the desperate, uncertain morning when she had first approached a quiet scullery maid with an unusual, almost impossible request to sit through the night with a duke whose cruelty had already driven away 11 trained nurses before her. She could not have imagined, on that difficult morning, that the request would eventually lead to this joyful celebration, though she found herself grateful beyond words for whatever instinct had guided her toward Mara in that moment of genuine desperation. Dr. Hale attended as well, offering his own quiet blessing to a union that represented, in his professional estimation, the most remarkable recovery he had witnessed in his considerable career treating patients throughout the county. He raised a glass during the celebration that followed the ceremony, offering a toast that acknowledged both the medical mystery of Alaric's illness and the equally mysterious, though far more comprehensible, power of genuine human connection in facilitating recovery that medicine alone had proven unable to accomplish. As the celebration continued into the evening, with music filling the restored ballroom for the first time in over 2 years, and dancing couples moving gracefully across floors that had stood silent and abandoned throughout the darkest months of Alaric's illness, the newly married Duke and Duchess of Glenmara found a quiet moment together near the tall windows overlooking the estate's gardens, now fully restored to their former beauty through months of careful attention and renewed hope. "Do you remember?" Alaric asked softly, his arm wrapped securely around his new wife as they watched the last golden light of evening settle over the hills beyond the gardens. The first time you entered my chamber, carrying nothing more than an armful of linens you had been asked simply to deliver and leave. I remember, Mara said, smiling at the memory of that uncertain first encounter, so different from the joyful celebration now surrounding them. I remember thinking you looked like a man, in a great deal of pain, far more than the anger everyone else in this house had warned me about. I was frightened, Alaric admitted, though I could not have named that fear clearly at the time, not even to myself. Frightened of dying alone, frightened of trusting anyone again, after everything I had already lost. Frightened most of all, that I had become someone unworthy of the kind of care and devotion my father had shown throughout his own lifetime, toward the people and the land he was responsible for protecting. You were never unworthy, Mara said firmly, turning to face him directly, her expression carrying the same steady conviction that had first drawn her toward his suffering on that difficult morning so many months before. You were simply lost, buried beneath grief and illness and betrayal that would have broken almost anyone facing the same trials. What I found beneath all of that, once you finally allowed yourself to be found, was a man of genuine strength and compassion, someone worthy of far more devotion than I have ever managed to properly express. Alaric drew her closer, resting his forehead gently against hers, as the music continued softly in the ballroom behind them, the celebration of their union continuing without their immediate presence, as the newly married couple stole this brief, private moment to properly acknowledge the remarkable journey that had brought them to this point together. I promise you, he said quietly, that whatever years remain ahead of us, I will spend them proving myself worthy of the faith you placed in me during the darkest period of my life, when every other person who might have offered care and comfort had already abandoned that effort entirely. You stayed, Mara, when staying offered you nothing beyond the risk of enduring my cruelty and uncertainty about whether your efforts would ever be rewarded with anything beyond continued suffering. That choice changed everything for me, and I intend to honor it for the remainder of whatever life we are fortunate enough to share together. And I promise you, Mara replied, her own voice steady with the quiet conviction that had carried her through every difficult trial since her arrival at Glenmara Manor, that I will continue standing beside you through whatever challenges still lie ahead, just as I stood beside you during those first uncertain weeks when your recovery seemed far from guaranteed. Illness may return, difficulties may arise that neither of us can properly anticipate, but I have learned, through both my brother's passing and your remarkable recovery, that presence and devotion carry a power that no obstacle, however severe, can ever fully overcome. They stood together in comfortable silence for several more moments, watching the evening settle fully over the restored gardens below, before finally returning to the celebration continuing in the ballroom behind them. Ready to embrace whatever future awaited them, together as partners, equally devoted to rebuilding not only Glenmara Manor's fortunes, but a genuine, lasting happiness that neither had believed themselves capable of finding again after everything they had separately endured before their paths finally, fatefully crossed. In the months and years that followed their wedding, Glenmara Manor flourished under their combined stewardship, the estate's finances fully restored under careful, honest management, the tenant families who had suffered under Vale's dishonest arrangements finally receiving the fair treatment they deserved, and the grand old house itself gradually filling once more with the warmth and laughter it had lacked throughout the difficult years of Alaric's illness and isolation. Mara, once a quiet scullery maid who had arrived at the manor with nothing more than a small cloth bag and a willingness to work hard, became known throughout the county not merely as the Duchess of Glenmara, but as a woman whose quiet strength and unwavering compassion had accomplished what no physician or medicine alone had managed to achieve, transforming both a dying man's fate and the fortunes of an entire estate through nothing more than her steady refusal to abandon someone in genuine need of care, regardless of how fiercely that need had initially been disguised beneath anger, cruelty, and despair. The story of the Duke who had driven away every nurse sent to care for him, only to find his salvation in the quiet devotion of a maid who simply refused to leave, became something of a local legend throughout the surrounding county in the years that followed, told and retold as a reminder that genuine healing often arrives not through grand gestures or dramatic interventions, but through the simple, steady presence of someone willing to remain beside another's suffering, without flinching away from it, offering nothing more complicated than patience, honesty, and an unwavering belief that every person, however deeply buried beneath their pain, remains worthy of care and the possibility of genuine recovery.